When you hear the word Viking, what comes to your mind? Close your eyes for a second. What do you see? A horned helmet? A wild warrior with a bloody axe? Burning monasteries? Ships appearing from the fog bringing death and destruction. That's the picture. We've all seen it 100 times, in movies, in cartoons, on book covers. It's strong, it's brutal, it's almost completely invented. Here's what archaeologists actually found after decades of digging. Thousands of graves. Weapons? Yes. Tools? Yes. Ships? Absolutely. Beautiful combs, jewelry, even toys for children. But horned helmets? Not a single one. Ever. That famous image, the horned barbarian, was born in the 19th century, not from history, from an opera stage. The real Vikings were farmers, traders, explorers. They crossed the Atlantic 500 years before Columbus. They were parents, craftsmen, storytellers. So who were they really? Let's go back, way back, and meet the real Vikings.
Most Vikings never went on a single raid. Let that sink in for a moment. The people we call Vikings, the vast majority of them, never picked up an axe in anger, never burned a village, never sailed off to terrorize monks on some distant island. So who were they? First, they were farmers. Every spring, when the ice melted and the days grew longer, they walked out into their fields. They plowed the stubborn northern soil with iron-tipped plows. They planted barley and oats, rye and cabbages. They raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. In the coastal settlements, they fished, cod, herring, even whale when they were lucky. Life was hard. The winters were long and dark, but the land provided. They were also craftsmen. In every Viking settlement, someone was working with their hands. Woodworkers carved intricate patterns into furniture and tools, gripping beasts and twisting serpents that seemed to move as you look at them. Bone and antler workers made combs, needles, and knife handles. Metal workers forged tools for farming and, yes, sometimes weapons. But they also made beautiful jewelry, brooches, arm rings, pendants, not for war, but for life, for love, for status. They lived in longhouses. These were not small huts. Imagine a building up to 30 meters long, 7 meters wide, with walls made of thick turf or wooden planks. Inside, along the walls, were raised platforms where people slept. In the center ran a long stone hearth. The fire never went out. It was the heart of the home. Around that fire, a whole extended family would gather. Sometimes 15 or 20 people, grandparents, parents, children, even servants or freed slaves. They told stories, they sang songs, they passed down the old tales, tales that would one day be written down in Iceland as the sagas we still read today. And when they did sail, because some of them did sail, it wasn't always for battle. The Viking ships were also trading vessels. The same sleek long ships that could strike fear along the English coast could be loaded with cargo. Furs from the deep northern forests, amber from the Baltic shores, walrus ivory so precious it was traded all the way to Baghdad. They traded with people from Greenland to Constantinople. They exchanged goods, ideas, even words. That's why English still has words like sky, egg, and they, all from Old Norse. So here's the truth. The Vikings were farmers and craftsmen. They were traders and explorers. They were parents, children, storytellers. They were people just trying to survive and thrive in a harsh world. And some of them, also went Viking.
But let's be clear about something. These people, these farmers, these craftsmen, these families sitting around the hearth, they could also sail. And not just along the coast, hugging the shore the way most sailors did. No, they crossed the open ocean, through storms that would sink lesser ships, through fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand, through freezing cold that turned the ropes to ice. in ships that, to modern eyes, look impossibly fragile. The Viking ship was a masterpiece of engineering, not designed in a drawing room by scholars, built by hand, by eye, by generations of knowledge passed down from father to son. They built them clinker style. That means overlapping planks, each one flexing against the next, so the whole ship moved with the waves instead of fighting them, like a snake, like a living thing. The hull was shallow, really shallow. That's called low draft. It meant these ships could sail in deep ocean, then glide right up onto a beach without needing a port. They could sail up rivers, shallow rivers, deep into enemy territory, or deep into trading country. And they were light enough that a crew could carry them over land, between rivers, between fjords. Imagine dragging your ship across a muddy path, then launching it on the other side and sailing on. Strong enough to cross the Atlantic, light enough to carry. So how did they navigate? They didn't have compasses, not like we think of them. They had something else. They watched the sun. They watched the stars. They watched the birds. There's a story, maybe true, maybe legend, about a Viking named Floki. He took ravens with him on his voyages, 3 ravens in cages. When he released the first, it flew back the way they'd come, land behind them. When he released the second, it circled the ship and returned, still no land ahead. When he released the third, it flew straight toward the horizon and didn't come back. They followed it, and they found land. That's how they found Iceland, how they found Greenland, and how, around the year 1000, they found Vinland. Vinland, present-day Newfoundland, Canada. 500 years before Columbus, the first Europeans in North America. Let that sink in. They didn't come to conquer, not at first. They came to explore, to trade, to find timber because Greenland had none, to settle. And for a while, they did. They built houses, they overwintered, they traded with the people already there, the ancestors of today's indigenous peoples, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. So when you think of Vikings, don't just think of raids and burning monasteries. Think of ships cutting through northern mists, silent and purposeful. Think of families crossing oceans, carrying everything they owned. Think of people who looked at the horizon, that endless gray line between sea and sky, and wondered what was beyond, and then went to find out.
But let's go deeper. Because the Vikings weren't just farmers and sailors and explorers. They also had a sophisticated understanding of law, of how to run a society, of how to settle disputes without killing each other every time. In Iceland, around the year 930, they did something remarkable. They established the Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament. Still running today, more than 1,000 years later. Think about that. While much of Europe was still figuring out feudalism, while kings fought kings over scraps of land, these people, these so-called barbarians, were gathering every summer to make laws. They met at a place called Thingvellir, a vast, dramatic plain between 2 tectonic plates. On one side, North America. On the other, Eurasia. Slowly pulling apart, inch by inch, year by year. A fitting place for laws to be made. People came from all over Iceland. Some traveled for weeks, across mountains, through rivers, around glaciers. They set up temporary camps. They traded goods. They told stories. They arranged marriages. They settled disputes. And the disputes were serious. Land boundaries. Inheritance. Murders. The sagas are full of these arguments, detailed, legalistic, passionate. People cared deeply about what was fair, what was right, what belonged to whom. The law wasn't just written down. It was spoken, memorized, recited aloud by the law speaker, a person whose job it was to remember the entire legal code. Imagine memorizing thousands of rules, then standing on a rocky outcrop and reciting them for everyone to hear. And here's something important. Those famous berserkers, the wild warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, biting their shields, howling like animals, they were real. But they weren't heroes. In the sagas, berserkers are almost always the bad guys. Troublemakers. Bullies. Men who show up at a farm, demand food, demand women, demand trouble. They're the ones who get exiled. Who get killed by the hero. Who cause problems for everyone. Society valued the farmer, the craftsman, the law speaker, the person who contributed, not the madman with an axe. They also valued things. Beautiful things. Viking art is stunning. It's not crude or primitive. It's intricate, delicate, full of meaning. Look closely at a Viking brooch. You'll see gripping beasts, animals with oversized paws clutching at the border, as if they're holding onto the metal. Interlacing patterns that twist and turn, impossible to follow, like tangled ropes or woven threads. Designs that seem to move as you look at them.
They carved these patterns into wood, into stone, into bone and antler. They made jewelry for women and men. They decorated their weapons, their tools, their ships. Even the simplest household object might have a small carved animal or a bit of pattern. They made these things not for war, for life, for status, for beauty, for the joy of creating something with their hands. And they passed these skills down, father to son, mother to daughter. Generation after generation, the knowledge survived. The pattern survived. The story survived. So when you imagine a Viking, don't just see the warrior. See the farmer, standing in his field at sunrise. See the law speaker, reciting ancient rules to a crowd of hundreds. See the craftsman, bent over a piece of bone, carving a tiny animal that no one will ever see but him. See the person who cared about justice and beauty as much as we do today.
Let's talk about women. Because in Viking society, women had rights that were remarkable for medieval Europe. The laws of the time, recorded in a medieval Icelandic text called Gragas, the Grey Goose Laws, show us something unexpected. Women could inherit property. They could own land independently, without a husband or father controlling it. They could divorce their husbands. Think about that. In an age when women across most of Europe were essentially property themselves, the Viking women had legal standing. When a woman married, she didn't disappear into her husband's family. She kept her own name, her own identity. The bride price paid by the husband and the dowry from her father both became her personal property. If the marriage ended, she took it with her. And divorce? It was surprisingly simple. A wife was as free as a husband to seek divorce. The sagas tell us some of the grounds: impotence, physical violence, that the husband trying to move her property abroad without consent. Even the husband wearing clothing considered effeminate could be grounds for divorce. The method was straightforward. Gather witnesses. State your complaint. Declare your intention to divorce. That was it. And apparently, there was no social stigma attached to either party. When a man was away trading, raiding, exploring, sometimes for months or even years, the woman ran everything. She held the keys to the locked pantry. She managed the farm, the livestock, and the servants. She made decisions about planting and harvesting. She controlled the family's survival through the long, dark winters. The keys weren't just practical. They were a symbol. When a woman was buried, those keys were often placed in her grave, a sign of her status and authority. Recent research from the University of Nottingham has also shed light on how pregnancy was viewed. Far from being a time of weakness, pregnant women in Viking sources were depicted as powerful figures. One remarkable silver figurine from a 10th century grave in Sweden shows a pregnant woman wearing a helmet, her hands on her belly, possibly symbolizing strength and ritual status.
Now, let's address something that has caused controversy among historians. In 2017, DNA tests on a famous grave in Birka, Sweden, a high-status warrior grave filled with swords, arrowheads, a spear, and 2 horses, revealed something shocking. The warrior was female. For more than a century, scholars had assumed this was a male warrior. The equipment, the status, the burial goods, everything said warlord. But science said otherwise. This was a woman who had been buried with the tools of war, someone who had lived and died as a warrior. The gaming pieces found on her lap suggested something even more significant. According to archaeologists from Uppsala and Stockholm universities, this indicates she was an officer, someone who worked with tactics and strategy and could lead troops in battle. Not just a warrior, but a military leader. The discovery forced scholars to reconsider. Historian Nancy Marie Brown argues that much of what we've taken as truth about Viking women is based not on archaeological data, but on 19th century Victorian biases. The idea that women couldn't be warriors, she suggests, says more about the 1800s than it does about the Viking Age. Viking lore had long hinted that not all warriors were men. One early 10th century Irish text tells of Inghen Ruaid, Red Girl, a female warrior who led a Viking fleet to Ireland. And numerous Viking sagas tell of shield maidens fighting alongside male warriors. But some archaeologists had considered these female warriors to be merely mythological embellishments, a belief colored by modern expectations of gender roles. The Birka discovery changed that. As one researcher put it, what we have studied was not a Valkyrie from the sagas, but a real-life military leader that happened to have been a woman. The sagas are filled with women who carry weapons. The legendary Hervair, daughter of a berserker, dressed as a man, joined a Viking crew and reclaimed her father's magic sword from his haunted grave. The fact that saga audiences found these stories believable suggests the idea of warrior women wasn't impossible to them. And the Valkyries, the supernatural beings who chose which warriors died in battle and which lived, were female. In Norse mythology, it was women who decided fate on the battlefield. One saga tells of Freydis, a pregnant woman who, in the heat of battle, bared her chest and struck it with her sword, terrifying her enemies. This wasn't a passive figure. This was an image of strength and action. Now, were warrior women common? Probably not. Most women, like most men, were farmers and mothers. But the fact that they existed at all, that they were remembered in stories and buried with weapons, tells us something important. Viking society could imagine women in roles of power. Some women became truly powerful. Take Eud, the deep-minded, one of the most famous women in Icelandic history. She was the daughter of a Norwegian chieftain, married to Olaf the White, a Viking king in Dublin. When her husband and son died, her son betrayed and killed in battle, Eud didn't collapse. She didn't seek protection from another man. She built a ship in secret. In secret. Think about that. A woman in the 9th century, commissioning a vessel, organizing a crew of 20 free men, and sailing into the unknown. She captained that ship from Scotland to Orkney, then to the Faroe Islands, and finally to Iceland, where she claimed land and became one of the first settlers. She brought her grandchildren, her followers, even her thralls. And when they arrived, she gave them land and freedom. Eud the Deep-Minded was a baptized Christian. She erected crosses where she prayed. But more than that, she was a leader. The only known female settler in Iceland to claim land as a chieftain, and she claimed the largest tract of any settler, male or female. Her story demonstrates something remarkable. Iceland wasn't settled only by powerful men. It was also settled by powerful women. Women who survived, who led, who made critical decisions that saved lives. Many prominent Icelanders of the Middle Ages trace their descent from Eud through her grandson and several granddaughters. In the 18th and 19th centuries, she became known as a national foremother. Today, a monument stands in Iceland in her memory. So here's the truth about Viking women. They managed farms while men were away. They owned property and could divorce. Some fought as warriors. Some led as chieftains. Nearly all had more rights and autonomy than women in most other parts of medieval Europe. When you imagine a Viking woman, don't see a passive figure waiting by the fire. See the woman with keys at her belt, running a household of 20 people. See the warrior buried with her sword and her gaming pieces, planning tactics for battle. See Eud, the deep-minded, standing at the prow of her ship, sailing toward an unknown shore, carrying her family and her future in her hands. These are the women of the Viking Age.
The Vikings had a rich artistic tradition. This wasn't just decoration, it was a way of seeing the world. Their art is unlike anything else in medieval Europe. It's wild. It's energetic. It's full of animals that twist and turn, gripping and biting, tangled in endless knots. Look closely at a Viking brooch. You'll see gripping beasts, animals with oversized paws clutching at the border, as if they're holding onto the metal itself. Their eyes are wide. Their bodies strain. Everything is in motion. This style didn't appear overnight. It evolved over centuries. Archaeologists and art historians have identified at least 6 distinct Viking art styles, each one building on the last. Oseberg, Bor, Jelling, Mammon, Ringerike, Uns. Each named after the place where the finest examples were found. The Oseberg style, from the early 9th century, is full of sinuous, gripping animals with detailed surface patterns. The Bor style, from the mid-9th to mid-10th century, introduced distinctive ring chain patterns and simple, powerful animal figures. The Jelling style, named after the famous Jelling stones in Denmark, appeared around the mid-10th century. It featured animal figures with elegant, ribbon-like bodies, often forming symmetrical compositions. The Mammon style, from the late 10th century, introduced plant motifs alongside the animals. Acanthus leaves, tendrils, and vines, borrowed from continental European art but transformed into something distinctly Norse. The Ringerike style, from the early 11th century, took the plant motifs further. Great sinuous tendrils curve and spiral across stone and wood. Animals are more naturalistic, but still caught in that Viking energy. And finally, the Hans style, the last of the Viking art styles, from the late 11th and early 12th centuries. It's the most elegant of them all. Slim, graceful animals interlace in flowing patterns. You can see it carved into the wooden panels of an stave church in Norway, a place where Viking art meets Christianity. They didn't just make weapons beautiful. They made everything beautiful. Combs. Think about that. Combs. They carved intricate patterns into ordinary objects. Combs for their hair, spoons for eating, even the humblest household tools. They made jewelry for women and men. Necklaces, brooches, arm rings. The arm ring wasn't just decoration. It was wealth, portable and visible. You could cut pieces off to pay for things. Viking economies were built on silver, and jewelry was the bank. They decorated their weapons. Swords had patterns inlaid in the blade, hilts wrapped in silver and copper. Axes were carved with intricate designs. A warrior's weapon was also a work of art. They carved into stone. Thousands of runestones still stand across Scandinavia, covered in patterns and animals, memorializing the dead or marking important events. The runes themselves, their alphabet, was sometimes carved with such skill that the letters become part of the design. They carved into wood. Doorways, bedposts, wagons, sleds. The Oseberg ship burial alone contained an astonishing collection of wooden objects: a wagon, 3 sleds, a cart, all covered in carvings that still make us catch our breath more than 1,000 years later. And then there were the stories. The Vikings didn't write much down. They carved runes, short inscriptions, names, memorials, but their great literature was oral, passed down by word of mouth, generation after generation. They called them sagas. Long prose narratives, told around the fire in the longhouse during those long dark winters. Stories of heroes and outlaws. Of family feuds and great voyages. Of love and betrayal and revenge. These weren't just entertainment. They were history, lore, identity. Through the sagas, people learned who they were, where they came from, what their ancestors had done. It wasn't until the 13th century, long after the Viking Age ended, that these stories were finally written down. In Iceland, mostly. Monks and scribes, working with vellum and ink, preserved what had been spoken for centuries. So we have them today. Egil's Saga, Njal's Saga, the Saga of the Greenlanders, the Saga of Eric the Red. Stories of exploration, of blood feuds, of women who fought, of men who sailed into the unknown. They also had poetry. Not just any poetry, some of the most complex, demanding poetry ever composed. The skalds, court poets, composed verses in praise of kings and jarls. But these weren't simple rhymes. They were intricate, layered, filled with kennings, poetic metaphors that required deep cultural knowledge to understand. A warrior might be called the feeder of wolves. A sword might be the wound hoe. A ship might be the sea steed. The poetry was like a puzzle, rewarding those who could unlock its meanings. It was dangerous work, being a skald. If your poem wasn't good enough, you might not leave the hall alive. But if it was brilliant, your name would live forever. And some skalds did live forever, their names still known, their verses still studied, 1,000 years later. Egil Skallagrimsson was one of the greatest. A warrior, a killer, and a poet of breathtaking skill. His saga tells us he composed his most famous poem, Sonatarek, The Loss of Sons, while mourning the death of 2 of his children. It's raw, honest, heartbreaking, and technically perfect. So when you think of Vikings, think of this too. Think of men and women sitting in a smoky longhouse, listening to a poet unravel the past. Think of carvers bent over a piece of wood, making beauty in the firelight. Think of a culture that valued art as much as war. This artistic tradition didn't die with the Viking Age. It transformed. It merged with Christian art, with European styles. But it never disappeared. The An style lived on in Norwegian stave churches. The animal motifs echoed in later Scandinavian folk art. The sagas were copied and recopied, eventually translated into every major language. Today, we can still see them. In the British Museum. In the National Museum of Denmark. In the Historical Museum in Stockholm. And in Iceland, where the sagas are still read, still loved, still part of everyday life. And in popular culture. Movies, TV shows, video games, they all draw on this imagery. Sometimes they get it wrong, those horned helmets. But sometimes they capture something true. That wild energy. That love of story. That belief that beauty matters. The Vikings didn't just make things. They made things beautiful. They didn't just live lives. They told stories about them. They carved their world into wood and stone and bone, and 1,000 years later, we can still see it. When you imagine a Viking, don't just see the warrior. See the carver, bent over a piece of antler, making something that would outlast him by centuries. See the poet, standing in a crowded hall, weaving words into something never heard before. See the storyteller, passing down the past so the future would remember. These were the artists of the Viking Age. Let's talk about trade. Because the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were some of the most connected traders of the medieval world. Their networks stretched from the frozen coasts of Greenland to the bustling markets of Baghdad. From the white cliffs of England to the rivers of Russia. They connected worlds that had rarely met. In Sweden, at the trading center of Birka, archaeologists have found Islamic silver coins, dirhams, from as far away as modern-day Iran and Iraq. In Denmark, at Hedeby, they found Byzantine silk, Frankish weapons, and even a Buddha statue from India. The Vikings didn't just take these things. They traded for them. They exchanged furs from the deep northern forests, sable, marten, fox, prized by eastern nobles. Walrus ivory, harder and whiter than elephant ivory, was carved into luxury goods for European churches. Amber from the Baltic coast, fossilized tree resin glowing like honey, was traded across the continent. And yes, they also traded slaves. This is the uncomfortable truth. The Vikings participated in the slave trade, capturing people during raids and selling them in eastern markets. The Old English word for slave was wel, meaning foreigner. In Old Norse, the word for slave was thrall. They weren't saints. But they weren't unique either. Every major medieval society had slaves. What made the Vikings different was the scale of their trade routes. They connected the slave markets of Dublin with the harems of Constantinople, the farms of Scandinavia with the courts of Baghdad. To support this trade, the Vikings built towns. Real towns, not just seasonal camps. Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, was one of the largest. At its peak, around the 10th century, it had perhaps 1,500 inhabitants. A semicircular wall protected the harbor, where ships from across Europe docked. Workshops produced combs, jewelry, shoes. Merchants from Frisia, Saxony, and Scandinavia lived side by side. Birka, in Sweden, was similar. Founded around 750, it became a key node in the network connecting Scandinavia with the Islamic world. Thousands of dirhams have been found there, evidence of trade so extensive that it transformed the Viking economy. Koppang in Norway was another. Smaller than Hedeby, but strategically placed on the Oslo fjord. Excavations have found evidence of trade with the British Isles, the Frankish Empire, and the Baltic. These weren't just trading posts. They were multicultural meeting places. People from different lands, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, came together to exchange goods and ideas. In that sense, the Viking towns were the first glimpse of the globalized world to come. The goods flowed both ways. From the east came silver, so much silver that it transformed Scandinavian society. In the early Viking Age, wealth was measured in cattle and land. By the late Viking Age, it was measured in silver coins and jewelry. Silver became the new currency. Literally, the Vikings developed a weight-based economy. They carried small folding scales and weights in pouches on their belts. When they traded, they would weigh the silver, coins, jewelry, hacked-up pieces, to determine its value. This hacked silver is found all over Scandinavia. Arm rings cut into pieces. Brooches chopped in half. Coins clipped at the edges. It wasn't vandalism, it was commerce. The weights themselves are fascinating. Many are decorated. Some are shaped like miniature animals. Others are simple spheres. But they're all standardized, allowing traders from different regions to agree on value. This system was flexible and practical. It didn't rely on a central authority minting coins. It worked wherever you went, with whoever you met. The silver came mostly from the east. Abbasid dirhams poured into Scandinavia through Russian rivers. So much silver arrived that it caused inflation, the first in Scandinavian history. By the late 9th century, the value of silver had dropped significantly. This wealth transformed society. New chieftains emerged, their power based not on land but on control of trade. Kings grew stronger, able to raise armies and build towns. The old tribal structures began to crumble, replaced by something new. But it wasn't just goods that traveled. Ideas traveled too. The Vikings encountered Christianity on their raids and trading voyages. At first, they resisted. The old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, had served them well. But over time, Christianity spread. In Hedeby, archaeologists found a small silver amulet shaped like Thor's hammer. Nearby, a woman was buried with a Christian cross around her neck. The same town, the same time, different beliefs. Sometimes they mixed. Some amulets combine cross and hammer, hedging bets. It's like wearing a crucifix and a Star of David, hedge your spiritual bets. Runestones tell the same story. Thousands of runestones still stand across Scandinavia. The oldest invoke the old gods. Later ones ask God to help the soul of the deceased. Some are explicitly Christian, carved with crosses and prayers. The runes themselves changed. New runes appeared, making it easier to write in Latin. The old Futhark gave way to younger versions. Writing wasn't just for magic anymore. It was for memorial, for ownership, for faith. And in Iceland, something remarkable happened. The old stories, the pagan myths, the heroic sagas, were written down by Christian monks. They preserved them, transformed them, passed them on. Without them, we would know almost nothing about Viking religion. The Vikings didn't disappear when they became Christian. They changed, adapted, survived. The Viking Age didn't end with a bang. It faded, transformed, became something else. Historians often point to 1066 as the end. That year, two battles changed everything. In September, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking warrior, landed in northern England with a fleet of 300 ships. He was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English king Harold Godwinson. Hardrada died, and with him, the dream of a Viking empire in England. But Harold Godwinson didn't have long to celebrate. 3 weeks later, William of Normandy landed in southern England. At the Battle of Hastings, Harold died too, and England passed into Norman hands. The Normans were themselves descendants of Vikings, Northmen, who had settled in France a century earlier. They had become French in language, Christian in faith, feudal in organization. But Viking blood ran in their veins. By 1066, Scandinavia itself had changed. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were now Christian kingdoms, part of mainstream Europe. Their kings minted coins, built cathedrals, corresponded with the Pope. The old gods were memories. The old ways were fading. Trade routes shifted. The silver from the east dried up as the Islamic world weakened. New markets opened in Western Europe. New powers emerged, the Holy Roman Empire, the Norman kingdoms, the rising cities of Italy. The Viking Age was over, but the Vikings weren't gone. They had simply become something new.
What did they leave behind? First, language. English still has hundreds of words from Old Norse: sky, egg, knife, window, leg, skin, them, they, their. Everyday words, so common we don't even notice them. Place names, too. Hundreds of towns ending in by, meaning farm or village, or thorp, meaning secondary settlement, across northern England. Second, law and governance. The Icelandic Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament, still meets today. The jury system has roots in Norse legal traditions. The very word law comes from Old Norse lagu. Third, stories. The sagas are read and studied around the world. They've inspired authors from J.R.R. Tolkien to George R.R. Martin. The image of the Viking, flawed, complex, human, lives on in our culture. Fourth, identity. Millions of people today trace their ancestry to Vikings, not just in Scandinavia, but in the British Isles, in Normandy, in Russia, in Iceland. The Vikings helped shape the nations of Northern Europe. And fifth, the idea of exploration. The Vikings showed that the world was bigger than we thought. They crossed oceans, settled new lands, pushed the boundaries of the known. That spirit lives on in every explorer, every adventurer, every person who looks at the horizon and wonders what's beyond.
So, who were the Vikings? They were farmers and explorers, traders and storytellers, lawmakers, and yes, sometimes readers. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters. They loved, they fought, they grieved, they celebrated. They carved beautiful things and told unforgettable stories. They built ships that crossed oceans and towns that connected worlds. They were not the horned helmet barbarians of popular imagination. They were not simple brutes. They were complex, sophisticated people who shaped the world we live in today. The Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, but the Viking legacy is all around us, in the languages we speak, in the laws we follow, in the stories we tell, in the blood that flows through millions of veins across the northern world. When you think of Vikings now, don't just think of raids and violence. Think of the farmer standing in his field at sunrise. Think of the trader weighing silver on a portable scale in a bustling market. Think of the storyteller reciting ancient sagas around a hearth fire. Think of the ship cutting through northern mists, carrying people toward an unknown shore. Think of the women with keys at their belts, running households and shaping destinies. Think of the craftsmen carving beauty into bone and wood and metal. These were the Vikings, and their echoes still reach us across 1,000 years. If you enjoyed this journey into the Viking world, please subscribe to Echoes of History. Every week, we uncover the past, one story at a time. Thank you for listening.
So let's return to the question we started with. When you hear the word Viking, what comes to mind now? Is it still the horned helmet, the brutal warrior, the mindless barbarian? Or is it something else? Maybe now you see a farmer standing in his field at sunrise, watching the mist rise over the fjord. His hands are calloused from the plow, not from the axe. He has children to feed, a farm to run, a life to live. Maybe you see a trader sitting in a bustling market in Birka or Hedeby, weighing silver on a small scale. Around him, people speak different languages: Norse, Frisian, Slavic, Arabic. Goods from 3 continents exchange hands: furs from the north, silk from the east, amber from the Baltic shores. Maybe you see a craftsman bent over a piece of bone or antler, carving an intricate pattern that will outlast him by 1,000 years. His hands are steady, his eyes are focused. He's making something beautiful, not for war, but for life. Maybe you see a woman with keys at her belt. The keys aren't just decoration, they're power. They mean she runs the household. She manages the farm while her husband is away. She makes decisions about planting and harvesting, about servants and stores, about the survival of her family through the long, dark winter. Maybe you see a mother telling stories to her children around the hearth fire, stories of heroes and gods, of voyages and adventures, of ancestors who came before. She's passing down the history of her people, a history that will one day be written down as the sagas we still read today. Maybe you see a warrior, but not the wild berserker of popular imagination, a real warrior, one who trains, who plans, who fights for a reason. A woman like the Burka warrior, buried with her sword and her gaming pieces, tools not just for battle, but for strategy and command. The Viking world was full of people. Complex, contradictory, human people. The Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, but the Vikings didn't disappear. They transformed. They became Normans, conquering England and Sicily, shaping the politics of medieval Europe. They became Russians, founding the first states along the Dnieper and Volga. They became Icelanders, preserving the old stories in a new land. They became Scandinavians, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, building Christian kingdoms that still exist today. Their language lives on in ours. Every time you say sky or egg or window or they, you're speaking Old Norse. Every town ending in by or thorpe across northern England marks where they settled. Their laws live on too. The Icelandic Althing, the world's oldest surviving parliament, still meets. The jury system has roots in Norse legal traditions. The very word law comes from Old Norse lagu. Their stories live on. The sagas are still read, still studied, still loved. They've inspired writers from J.R.R. Tolkien to George R.R. Martin. The image of the Viking, flawed, complex, human, lives on in our culture. So what can we learn from the Vikings? First, that people are never simple. The Vikings were farmers and raiders, traders and explorers, craftsmen and warriors. They were capable of great beauty and great violence, like all people in all times. To reduce them to one thing is to miss the truth. Second, that connection matters. The Vikings built networks that stretched across continents. They traded with people from Greenland to Baghdad. They exchanged not just goods, but ideas, technologies, words. They showed that the world is bigger than we think, and that we're all connected. Third, that stories matter. The Vikings told stories around their hearth fires for centuries before anyone wrote them down. Those stories shaped who they were, how they saw themselves, what they believed, and those same stories still shape us today. Fourth, that beauty matters. The Vikings carved beautiful things, even ordinary things like combs and spoons. They decorated their weapons, their ships, their homes. They believed that life should be beautiful, even in a harsh northern world. And fifth, that exploration matters. The Vikings looked at the horizon and wondered what was beyond. They crossed oceans, settled new lands, pushed the boundaries of the known. That spirit of exploration, that curiosity about what lies beyond, is part of being human.
So here we are, at the end of our journey through the Viking world. We've traveled from the farms of Denmark to the markets of Burka, from the longhouses of Iceland to the ships that crossed the Atlantic, from the carvings of Oseberg to the stories of the sagas. We've met farmers and traders, craftsmen and warriors, law speakers and storytellers. We've met women with keys at their belts, holding power in their hands. We've met explorers who sailed into the unknown, carrying everything they owned. And we've learned that the Vikings were not who we thought they were. They were more complex, more sophisticated, more human than the myths suggest. The horned helmet is a myth. The mindless barbarian is a myth. But the real Vikings, the people who lived and loved and worked and fought and died in Scandinavia 1,000 years ago, they were real. and their echoes still reach us. In the language we speak, in the laws we follow, in the stories we tell, in the blood that flows through millions of veins across the northern world. Every time you look at a map and wonder what's beyond the horizon, you're echoing them. Every time you tell a story around a fire, you're echoing them. Every time you make something beautiful, just because it should be beautiful, you're echoing them. The Viking Age is over. But the Vikings are not gone. They live on, in us, in our world, in our imagination. If you enjoyed this journey into the Viking world, please take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of History. Every week, we uncover the past, one story at a time. We explore forgotten tales, ancient mysteries, and historical figures through immersive storytelling. We dig into the books, documents, and archives to find the truth behind the myths. Next time, we'll travel to another time, another place, another story. Maybe ancient Rome. Maybe the mysteries of Egypt. Maybe the forgotten queens of the Middle Ages. The past is vast. There's always more to discover. So hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell if you want notifications. And join us next time as we continue to explore the echoes of history. Thank you for listening.